Memphis, Tennessee. The year was 1956. Outside the small rehearsal studio, the city was alive with the restless energy of a new sound that was beginning to shake America. Rock and roll was still young. Radios played country, blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues. Young musicians gathered in cramped rooms, arguing about chords, rhythm, and which sound would belong to the future. Inside one such studio, however, nobody was talking about the future. They were talking about Elvis Presley. The room was narrow and warm, with guitars hanging along the walls and old amplifiers humming softly in the corners. Cigarette smoke drifted beneath the ceiling. Several young musicians had gathered for an evening rehearsal, each one convinced that he had something to prove. And among them was a guitarist named Raymond Carter. Raymond was talented. Everyone knew it. He could play quickly, confidently, and loudly. Whenever he performed, people watched his hands. Whenever someone complimented him, he accepted the praise as though it had always belonged to him. But that night, Raymond wanted something more than applause. He wanted to prove that some musicians were real, and others were simply famous. Then the studio door opened. Conversation stopped. A young man stepped inside. His clothes were simple, his expression was calm. He looked around the room and gave a polite nod. Several musicians immediately recognized him. Elvis Presley. By 1956, his name was already becoming impossible to ignore. His records were climbing. His performances drew screaming crowds. His voice, his energy, and his stage presence had begun changing the way young people looked at music. But Raymond only leaned back in his chair. A smirk appeared on his face. "Well," he said loudly, "look who decided to visit us." Several heads turned. Another musician smiled. Elvis Presley. A few men chuckled. Elvis smiled politely. He had not come there to compete. He had been invited to listen to several local musicians rehearse and spend some time with people who loved music as much as he did. That was all. But Raymond looked at the guitars hanging along the wall. Then back at Elvis. "I thought you were a singer." Elvis nodded. "That's what most people know me for." "Exactly." More laughter followed. Elvis remained calm. Near the center of the room, a beautiful acoustic guitar rested against an empty chair. Raymond pointed toward it. "You probably couldn't even play one of those." The laughter grew louder. One young musician looked uncomfortable. He had seen Elvis holding a guitar before. But he said nothing. Raymond stood. "Come on." Elvis looked at him. "Pick it up." Elvis smiled slightly. "I don't think that's necessary." That answer made Raymond laugh. "I knew it." Someone in the back shouted. "He's never played guitar in his life." More laughter. Elvis said nothing. For a brief moment, he simply looked around the room. These men knew his name. They knew his face. Some had heard his records. Some had watched him perform. But they had decided that was enough to know everything about him. And Elvis knew that feeling. He had known it for years. People had judged him before speaking to him. They had judged the way he dressed, the way he moved, the music he loved, the sound of his voice. Some said he was too country. Others said he was not country enough. Some said his music was too wild. Others said it would disappear before anyone remembered it. Elvis had heard every kind of doubt. But there was something about this moment that felt different. Perhaps because he had not come there looking for an argument. He had simply come to listen. Raymond crossed his arms. "What's the matter, Elvis?" "Nothing." "Then play." The room slowly became quiet. Raymond pointed toward the guitar again. "If you know so much about music, pick it up." Elvis looked at the instrument, then at Raymond. "You really want me to?" Raymond smiled. "Please." For several seconds, Elvis did not move. An older musician, sitting near one of the amplifiers, watched him carefully. He noticed something. There was no anger in Elvis's face, no embarrassment, no fear, but there was a quiet disappointment, as though Elvis was not hurt because they had insulted him. He was disappointed because they had chosen to laugh instead of listen. Finally, Elvis walked toward the guitar. The room became silent. Every eye followed him. He reached down. His fingers touched the wood. And suddenly, something changed. The laughter disappeared. Elvis did not hold the guitar like someone touching an unfamiliar instrument. He held it naturally, comfortably, like something that belonged in his hands. He sat down, adjusted his position, quietly checked the strings. Raymond's smile became smaller. One musician leaned toward another. "Wait a minute." Elvis looked around the room. His eyes stopped on Raymond. "You still want me to play?" Raymond forced another laugh. "Go ahead." Elvis nodded. "All right." He lowered his eyes. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then, a soft chord filled the room. It was simple, clean, controlled. Raymond's expression did not change. Not yet. Elvis played another chord. Then another. The rhythm slowly began to form. It was warm, natural, alive. A few musicians stopped smiling. Elvis continued. His right hand moved across the strings with an easy rhythm. His fingers knew where to go. There was no hesitation, no struggle, no searching for the next note. The sound grew stronger, and suddenly the room was no longer watching Elvis Presley, the famous singer. They were watching a musician, a man listening to the instrument, feeling the rhythm, letting the music move forward naturally. One of the younger guitarists slowly sat down. "Listen to that." Raymond heard him. Quiet, but his own confidence had already begun to disappear. Elvis changed the rhythm. The sound became faster, not wildly fast, not designed to show off. It simply flowed. Country, blues, gospel influence. The sounds that had surrounded Elvis since his earliest years seemed to move through his hands. The older musician near the amplifier stared. Now he understood. This was not a performance Elvis had learned for this moment. This was part of him. The room listened. And then Elvis did something that nobody expected. He began singing softly, not loudly, not like a stage performance, just enough for the words and rhythm to blend together. The studio changed. The walls seemed smaller. The room seemed quieter. And for several seconds, nobody remembered why Elvis had picked up the guitar in the first place. Then the music stopped. The final chord faded. Silence. Complete silence. Raymond stood in the middle of the room. His arms had fallen to his sides. The same hands that had pointed at Elvis only moments earlier now hung uselessly beside him. Elvis looked at him, then smiled. Not cruelly, not proudly, just calmly. Raymond opened his mouth. But before he could speak, Elvis looked back down at the guitar. and began playing again. This time, the rhythm was different, more complicated, more alive. The musicians leaned closer. Someone whispered, "How did he?" Another man shook his head. "He knows exactly what he's doing." Raymond stared. For the first time that night, he was no longer looking at Elvis as a celebrity. He was looking at another musician. And that realization hurt. Because Raymond had spent the entire evening believing he was about to expose Elvis. Instead, Elvis had exposed something inside him. His arrogance, his need to feel superior, his belief that fame and musical ability could not exist together. But Elvis continued playing. And strangely, he was no longer playing for Raymond. He was simply playing. That was what made it impossible to look away. Then, almost without warning, Elvis stopped. The final note hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Raymond slowly looked down. Finally, he whispered, "I was wrong." Elvis placed the guitar across his lap. The room remained silent. Raymond raised his eyes. "I thought." He stopped. The words were difficult now. "I thought you just stood on stage with one because it looked good." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Elvis said nothing. Raymond took a breath. "I didn't know." Elvis nodded slowly. "I know." That was all. No anger. No revenge. No attempt to humiliate him. Elvis stood and carefully handed the guitar toward Raymond. But Raymond did not immediately take it. He looked at Elvis. "Why didn't you get angry?" Elvis smiled faintly. "Would that have taught you anything?" Raymond had no answer. Elvis placed the guitar gently in his hands. "The problem wasn't that you didn't believe I could play." Raymond listened. Elvis looked around the room. "The problem was that you decided who I was before you gave me a chance to show you." Nobody spoke. Outside, a car passed along the Memphis street. Inside, the words remained. Elvis continued, "A person can surprise you." He paused, "But only if you stop laughing long enough to see what they can do." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the older musician near the amplifier began clapping. Once, twice, a few others joined. Soon the small studio filled with applause. But Elvis did not bow. He did not celebrate. He simply stood there, looking slightly embarrassed by all the attention. Raymond finally stepped forward. He held the guitar tightly. "Teach me." The applause stopped. Elvis looked at him. "What?" Raymond smiled nervously. "That rhythm." Elvis looked toward the chair, then back at Raymond. "Sit down." A few musicians laughed. But this time, the laughter was warm. Respect had entered the room where arrogance had been only minutes earlier. And as the men slowly gathered around Elvis, nobody noticed the person standing outside the studio window. A man in a dark coat. Watching. Listening. He had arrived late. He had heard enough. And his expression was not impressed. It was angry. Very angry. Because he had not come to hear Elvis play. He had come to settle something much older. Something Elvis had no idea was waiting for him. The stranger stepped away from the window. Rain had begun falling over the streets of Memphis. He pulled his coat tighter, then quietly whispered, "Let him enjoy his applause." A pause. His eyes remained fixed on the studio. "He won't be smiling for long." And inside, unaware that someone was watching, Elvis picked up the guitar again. He smiled at Raymond and said, "Now let's start with the first chord. Now let's start with the first chord." Raymond sat down. The same guitarist who had laughed at Elvis only minutes earlier now held the instrument with both hands, listening carefully. Elvis stood beside him. "Relax your wrist." Raymond adjusted his hand. "Like this." Elvis smiled. "Almost." The other musicians gathered around them. Nobody was competing anymore. Nobody was laughing. The room that had been filled with arrogance had become something completely different. For the next several minutes, Elvis showed Raymond the rhythm slowly. Not like a teacher trying to prove he knew more. Not like a winner reminding a loser who had been right. He simply explained what he felt. "Don't fight the rhythm," Elvis said. Raymond frowned. "What does that mean?" Elvis reached for the guitar. "Music can tell when you're forcing it." A few musicians smiled. Elvis continued. "You can know every chord in the world, but if you aren't listening, you're just making noise." Raymond looked at him. "And you're saying I don't listen?" Elvis smiled. "I'm saying you're learning." The room laughed. Raymond laughed too. For the first time that night, he did not feel insulted. He felt challenged, but in a good way. He played again. The rhythm stumbled. Elvis shook his head. "Again." Raymond tried. "Better." "Again." The older musician near the amplifier crossed his arms and smiled. He had seen hundreds of young performers compete. He had seen friendships destroyed because one musician wanted to be better than another. But he had rarely seen someone respond to humiliation the way Elvis had. Most men would have played harder. Most would have enjoyed watching Raymond suffer. Elvis had done the opposite. He had turned the insult into a lesson. Outside the window, however, the stranger was still there. Rain slid down his dark coat. He stood beneath the shadow of a building across the street. Watching. Waiting. Inside, Elvis had no idea. "That's it," Elvis said. Raymond looked surprised. "That was right. Closer. Closer." Elvis laughed. "Don't get too proud yet." The room laughed again. Raymond shook his head. "You know, you're different than I thought." Elvis looked at him. "That seems to be happening a lot tonight." Raymond became serious. "No, I mean it." Elvis waited. Raymond looked at the guitar. "I thought you were just Elvis Presley." Several musicians exchanged looks. Elvis smiled slightly. "And what does that mean?" "You know." Raymond searched for the words. "The records, the girls screaming, the television, everybody talking about you." Elvis's expression changed slightly. Raymond continued. "I thought maybe you forgot what it was like to sit in a room like this." Elvis looked around the cramped studio, then toward the old amplifiers, the worn chairs, the instruments. "I haven't forgotten." His voice became quieter. "Don't think I ever could." The older musician watched him carefully. Elvis looked down at the guitar. "Before people knew my name, I played wherever I could." Nobody interrupted. Small rooms, empty rooms, places where nobody cared whether I was there or not. Raymond listened. Elvis smiled faintly. "And sometimes that was better." "Better." Elvis nodded. "When nobody expects anything from you, you get to find out what you really sound like." The room became silent. Raymond looked at him differently now. Not as a famous singer, not as a celebrity, as someone who had once been unknown too. Then, knock. Everyone turned toward the studio door. The sound was loud. 3 hard knocks. Nobody moved. Raymond frowned. Are we expecting someone? One of the musicians shook his head. The knocks came again. Knock, knock, knock. Elvis looked toward the door. The older musician stood. I'll get it. He walked slowly across the room. But before he reached the handle, the door opened. The man standing there was tall, older than Elvis. His dark coat was soaked from the rain. Water dripped onto the studio floor. He did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He looked directly at Elvis and said, "So this is where you are." The room went quiet. Elvis stared at him. For a second, his expression changed. Raymond noticed it. "You know him." Elvis remained still. The stranger stepped inside. Slowly, he closed the door behind him. "Yes," Elvis finally said. The man gave a cold smile. "It's been a long time." Elvis did not answer. Raymond looked between them. "Who is this?" The stranger ignored him. He continued staring at Elvis. "Playing guitar now." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The stranger looked toward the instrument. "I remember when you used to say you were going to make something of yourself." Elvis's jaw tightened. The older musician stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private rehearsal." The stranger looked at him. "I'll leave." Then he looked back at Elvis. "But first, I want to hear something." Elvis did not move. The stranger smiled. "What happened?" Raymond suddenly understood. This man had not come by accident. "You still don't like people telling you what to do." Elvis's voice became firm. "Why are you here?" The stranger's smile disappeared. "I came to see if you were still pretending." The room froze. Raymond took one step forward. "What does that mean?" The stranger looked around, then laughed quietly. "Don't you know?" Elvis spoke sharply. "That's enough." But the stranger continued. "He wasn't always Elvis Presley." Nobody answered. The man pointed at Elvis. "Before the records, before the crowds, before the fancy clothes." Elvis stared at him. The stranger smiled. He was just a quiet kid with a guitar. Elvis's face remained controlled, but his eyes had changed. The stranger took another step, and he was terrified. The word seemed to strike the room. Raymond looked at Elvis. Elvis did not deny it. The stranger laughed. "You should have seen him." Elvis finally stepped forward. "Stop." The man ignored him. He was so afraid of getting on stage that his hands would shake. The room remained silent. The stranger's voice grew louder. "And now look at him." He spread his arms. "America's new golden boy." Elvis looked toward the floor. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then Raymond spoke. "So what?" Everyone turned. The stranger looked at him. Raymond stepped forward. So his hands shook. The stranger smiled. "You don't understand." "No." Raymond shook his head. "I think I do." The stranger's expression changed. Raymond looked at Elvis. "I was laughing at him half an hour ago." Elvis raised his eyes. Raymond continued. I thought I knew everything about him because I knew his name. The stranger stared. But maybe that's your problem too. The room became silent. The stranger looked at Raymond coldly. You don't know anything about me. Raymond nodded. Exactly. Those words stopped the man. Elvis looked at Raymond. Something in his expression softened. Raymond continued. You came in here and decided who he was. He pointed toward Elvis. You decided he was pretending. The stranger's face hardened. You don't know what he did. Elvis spoke quietly. Raymond. But Raymond continued. No. He looked at Elvis. You helped me tonight. Elvis stared. Raymond turned back. Now let me say something. The stranger clenched his jaw. The older musician stepped closer. What exactly did Elvis do to you? For the first time, the stranger looked uncertain. Elvis knew why. Because he did not want to explain. He wanted anger. He wanted a scene. He wanted Elvis to react. Finally, Elvis spoke. My father borrowed money from him. The entire room went silent. The stranger smiled. Finally, Elvis continued. It was years ago. Years. The man laughed. You think years change what happened? Elvis looked directly at him. No. The stranger's smile disappeared. But they can change people. The man stepped closer. Your father promised to pay me back. Elvis nodded. I know. And he didn't. I know. The stranger's voice grew louder. I lost money. Elvis remained calm. I know. Raymond stared. The stranger stepped closer again. And then suddenly, you became famous. Elvis's expression hardened. So that's what this is. The man smiled. You owe me. Elvis looked at him. My father's debt is not something I can erase by pretending it never happened. Then pay it. The room froze. Elvis said nothing. The stranger leaned forward. You've got money now. Raymond moved. But Elvis raised one hand. The stranger continued. You sing about people, you stand there smiling for cameras. His voice became bitter. But when it comes to doing the right thing, enough. Elvis's voice was quiet. But everyone heard it. The stranger stopped. Elvis stepped closer. If there is something my family legally owes you, there are ways to discuss it. The man laughed. Lawyers. Elvis shook his head. No. He pointed toward the door. Respectfully. The stranger stared at him. Elvis continued. But you don't walk into a room full of strangers and try to shame me for something you won't even explain honestly. The man became angry. You think you're better than me now? Elvis looked at him. No. The answer came instantly. The stranger paused. Elvis glanced at Raymond, then back at the man. I spent too much of my life worrying about what people thought of me to start believing I'm better than anyone. The room fell silent. Then, near the middle of the studio, the telephone rang. Everyone jumped slightly. The older musician walked over and answered. Yes. His expression changed. He listened, then looked at Elvis. It's for you. Elvis frowned. Who is it? The older musician covered the receiver. A man says it's urgent. Elvis walked toward the telephone. The stranger watched him. Elvis lifted the receiver. This is Elvis. At first, he said nothing. Then his face slowly changed. What? Raymond stepped closer. Elvis listened. His hand tightened around the receiver. When? The room became completely silent. Elvis listened again, then slowly placed the telephone down. The stranger watched him. What is it? Elvis looked toward him. His expression had changed. Not anger, not fear, something heavier. Elvis spoke quietly. My father is missing. Nobody moved. Raymond stared. What? Elvis looked toward the stranger. The man suddenly stopped smiling. Elvis continued. The caller said someone saw him leaving town. The stranger shook his head. I don't know anything about that. Elvis watched him. Then why did you come here tonight? The stranger stepped backward. I came about the money. Elvis took one step toward him. And how did you know exactly where I would be? Nobody answered. The rain hammered against the windows. Raymond looked toward the studio door. The stranger's face had gone pale. Then the telephone rang again. Everyone froze. The older musician stared at it. Nobody moved. It rang a second time. Elvis slowly reached for the receiver. His voice was low. Hello. A voice spoke on the other end. Nobody in the room could hear the words, but they saw Elvis's face. His eyes widened. Then he slowly turned toward the stranger. The man took another step backward. Elvis whispered, "Don't move." The room went silent. Raymond looked at the stranger. What happened? Elvis lowered the telephone. His voice was barely above a whisper. The caller said the man who knows where my father is. He paused. The stranger stared at him. Elvis pointed directly at him. Is standing in this room. Nobody moved. The rain beat against the studio windows. The telephone receiver was still in Elvis Presley's hand, and every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the stranger standing near the door. The man's face had lost all its color. Raymond took one step backward. The older musician whispered, "Is that true?" The stranger said nothing. Elvis placed the receiver back on its cradle. The sound of it touching the table seemed louder than it should have. Then Elvis looked directly at the man. My father. The stranger swallowed. Elvis, listen. Where is he? I don't know. Elvis took a slow step forward. The stranger immediately raised both hands. I swear I don't know where he is. Raymond stepped between them. Elvis. But Elvis's eyes never left the man. The caller said you know. The stranger shook his head. I know something. The room became silent. Elvis's voice lowered. Then tell me. For several seconds, the man looked toward the door. Then toward the musicians. He seemed to be deciding whether to run. But there was nowhere to go without everyone seeing him. Finally, he sighed. My name is Daniel. Elvis stared at him. I remember. Daniel looked down. I didn't come here to hurt you. Then why did you follow me? Daniel hesitated. Elvis's expression hardened. Answer me. Daniel slowly reached into his coat. Several musicians moved back. Raymond's hand tightened around the neck of the guitar. But Daniel pulled out nothing more than a folded piece of paper. He held it toward Elvis. I received this yesterday. Elvis took it. The paper was old and wrinkled. There was an address written on it. And beneath the address, one sentence: "If you want the truth about your father, come alone." Raymond looked over Elvis's shoulder. "Who sent that?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." Elvis looked at him. "And you expected me to believe that?" "No." Daniel's voice was quiet. "I expected you to hate me." Elvis stared. Daniel continued. "Years ago, your father borrowed money from me, that's true." Nobody spoke. "But he paid me back." Elvis frowned. "What?" Daniel nodded. "Not all at once, but he paid every cent." Elvis looked at the paper again. Daniel's voice became heavier. "I kept blaming him because it was easier than admitting I was angry about something else." "What?" Daniel looked away. "Your success." The words hit the room like a slap. Daniel laughed bitterly. "I watched your name get bigger, I watched people cheer for you, and I thought, why him?" Elvis said nothing. Daniel continued. "I told myself you had forgotten where you came from." Raymond watched him carefully. "But when I heard about this letter, I went to your father's house." Elvis's eyes narrowed. "You saw him?" Daniel nodded. "This morning." Elvis stepped closer. "What did he say?" Daniel swallowed. "He told me not to tell you." The room went silent. Elvis's face changed. Daniel continued. "He said you had enough pressure, enough people following you, enough people wanting something from you." "Where is he?" "I don't know." Elvis clenched his jaw. "Daniel." "I followed him." Everyone froze. Daniel looked toward the rain-covered window. "He left his house in a car with two men." Raymond whispered. "Two men?" Daniel nodded. "I thought they were friends. Your father didn't look afraid." Elvis stared. "Where did they go?" Daniel looked at the paper. "The address." Elvis's eyes dropped. "A warehouse district outside the center of Memphis." Raymond shook his head. "You can't go there alone." Elvis folded the paper. "My father is there." "You don't know that." "No." Elvis looked up. "But I know he's somewhere." Daniel stepped forward. "I'll go with you." Elvis stared at him. "Why?" Daniel looked ashamed. "Because I should have told you sooner." Raymond spoke. "And because you know something you're not saying." Daniel's face tightened. Before anyone could ask another question, a loud crash came from outside. Everyone turned. One of the studio windows had shattered. Glass exploded across the floor. The musicians shouted and dropped behind chairs. Raymond grabbed Elvis's arm. "DOWN." A dark object rolled across the wooden floor. It stopped beside the amplifier. Nobody moved. Elvis stared at it. Smoke began rising. The older musician shouted, "Out, everybody out." The room exploded into panic. Elvis grabbed Raymond. "Move." Musicians rushed toward the back door. Daniel froze. Elvis looked at him. "Come on." They ran outside into the rain just as thick smoke began pouring from the broken window. A sharp burst sounded behind them. Not a massive explosion, but enough to send everyone running into the street. Raymond turned back. "What was that?" Elvis was breathing hard. "A warning." Daniel stared at him. "You think?" Elvis looked at the warehouse address. "They don't want us going there." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Raymond walked toward Elvis. "You're still going." Elvis nodded. Yes. Raymond shook his head. Then I'm coming. No. Elvis. No. Raymond stepped closer. You sat down and taught me after I insulted you. Elvis looked at him. Raymond continued. You could have humiliated me. Elvis, please. But you didn't. Daniel watched silently. Raymond pointed toward the dark street. Now someone is trying to stop you from finding your father. Elvis shook his head. This isn't your fight. Raymond gave a nervous smile. Maybe not. He looked back at the damaged studio. But you already taught me something tonight. Elvis waited. Raymond's expression became serious. You said music can tell when you're forcing it. Elvis nodded slowly. Raymond continued. So can a person. Elvis stared at him. Raymond pointed toward the address. You're going. The rain continued falling. And I don't think you're going to stop. Elvis looked toward Daniel. Then back at Raymond. Finally, he nodded. All right. Raymond exhaled. Daniel frowned. You're both making a mistake. Elvis looked at him. You're coming too. Daniel's face went pale. No. Elvis stepped closer. You followed my father. I told you I lost them. Then show us where. Daniel looked at the address. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he nodded. They climbed into Raymond's old car. The engine coughed before starting. Elvis sat in the passenger seat. Daniel sat behind them. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, the city lights reflected across the windshield. Nobody spoke. Elvis held the folded paper. His thoughts were racing. His father had told Daniel not to tell him. Why? Who were the two men? And why had someone attacked the studio? Raymond finally broke the silence. Elvis. Yes. If this is dangerous. Elvis looked out the window. It already is. The warehouse district appeared ahead. Old buildings. Dark streets. Almost no traffic. Daniel leaned forward. Stop here. Raymond parked beneath a broken street lamp. Daniel pointed toward a building at the end of the road. That one. Elvis looked. The windows were dark. The large wooden doors were closed. Nothing moved. Raymond whispered. I don't like this. Elvis opened the car door. Daniel grabbed his arm. Wait. Elvis turned. Daniel was terrified. For the first time, Elvis believed him. There's something else I didn't tell you. Elvis stared. What? Daniel looked toward the warehouse. Then back at Elvis. When I followed your father. He paused. I heard one of the men say your name. Everything went silent. Raymond slowly turned around. Elvis's expression changed. What did he say? Daniel swallowed. He said. A sound came from the warehouse. All three men froze. A guitar chord. One single chord. Slow. Clear. Impossible to mistake. Elvis stared toward the darkness. Then came another chord. The melody was familiar. A melody Elvis had played earlier that night in the studio. Raymond whispered. How could anyone know that? Elvis slowly stepped out of the car. Daniel shouted, Elvis! But Elvis was already walking toward the warehouse. The guitar played again. One chord, then another, like someone inside was waiting for him. And as Elvis reached the dark entrance, the music suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Then, from somewhere inside the warehouse, a voice whispered, "Come in, Elvis. Come in, Elvis." The voice came from deep inside the warehouse. Elvis stopped at the entrance. Behind him, Raymond and Daniel stood frozen in the rain. Nobody could see who was inside. Only darkness. Only silence. Then, a single guitar chord echoed again. Elvis looked over his shoulder. "Stay here." Raymond immediately shook his head. "No." Elvis frowned. "Raymond, you said that once tonight." "What?" "That I should sit down." Despite everything, Elvis almost smiled. Raymond stepped beside him. "This time, I'm not sitting down." Daniel looked toward the warehouse. "I know this place." Both men turned. Daniel's face was pale. Years ago, it belonged to a man named Walter Briggs. Elvis waited. He made money lending to people who had nowhere else to go. Elvis's eyes narrowed. "And my father?" Daniel looked down. "He knew Briggs." Raymond whispered, "You knew about this." "Not everything." Daniel pointed toward the darkness. "But I know enough to tell you this is dangerous." The guitar played again. This time, the melody was unmistakable. The same rhythm Elvis had played inside the studio. Someone had heard him. Someone had followed him. Elvis slowly pushed open the warehouse door. It groaned. Raymond and Daniel followed. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. A weak light burned at the far end of the building. And beneath it sat a man holding a guitar. His face was hidden. Elvis stepped forward. "Where's my father?" The man struck another chord. Elvis stopped. "Who are you?" The stranger finally raised his head. Elvis recognized him. Walter Briggs. Older now, but the same man Daniel had described. Briggs smiled. "Good evening, Elvis." Raymond whispered, "That's him." Elvis ignored him. "Where is my father?" Briggs looked toward the darkness behind him. "Xavier." Elvis took a step forward. "Let me see him." "Soon." Elvis's jaw tightened. Briggs smiled. "You've changed." Elvis said nothing. "I remember when you were just a boy." Elvis stared. Briggs continued. "You used to come with your father, quiet little thing, always holding that guitar." Raymond looked at Elvis. Elvis remembered. Not every detail, but enough. His father had known Briggs once. A connection Elvis had never fully understood. Briggs slowly stood. "I always wondered what would happen to you." He looked Elvis up and down. "Now look." Elvis's voice hardened. "Why am I here?" Briggs held up a small envelope. "Because your father kept something from me." Daniel's eyes widened. "What?" Briggs looked at him. "Quiet." Daniel stepped backward. Elvis stared at the envelope. "What is it?" "A document." "What document?" "One that could cost me everything." Elvis looked toward the shadows. "And you think my father has it?" Briggs smiled. "I know he did." Suddenly, Elvis. The voice came from somewhere behind the crates. Elvis froze. "His father. Dad." Elvis rushed forward. But Briggs raised a hand. Several men stepped from the darkness. Raymond stopped. Daniel whispered, "I told you." Elvis looked around. He was surrounded. Briggs smiled, still so impatient. Elvis stared at him. "What do you want?" Briggs lifted the envelope. "A signature." Raymond laughed bitterly. "A signature." Briggs looked at him. "Your friend will sign a statement saying he knows nothing about my business." Elvis frowned. "What?" Briggs smiled. "People believe famous men." Elvis understood. "A false statement." Briggs wanted protection. "And if I refuse?" Briggs looked toward the darkness. Elvis's father cried out again. "Elvis, don't do it." Elvis closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. "No." Briggs's smile vanished. Raymond stared at Elvis. "No." Elvis stepped closer. "I won't sign a lie." One of Briggs's men moved. Raymond whispered, "Are you crazy?" Elvis kept his eyes on Briggs. "Maybe." Briggs walked toward him. "You're choosing a piece of paper over your father." Elvis's face tightened. "No." "Then sign." Elvis shook his head. "Let him go." Briggs laughed. "You're in no position to make demands." Then Elvis noticed something. The guitar, still lying on the chair beneath the weak light. The same melody. The same chords. Elvis suddenly understood. Briggs had not played them. Someone else had. His father. Elvis looked toward the shadows. "Dad played that." Briggs smiled. "Your father remembers more than you think." Elvis's expression changed. He remembered his childhood. His father showing him simple rhythms. Sitting with him. Listening. The first time Elvis had held a guitar. Before the crowds. Before fame. Before anyone had laughed. Music had been family. Briggs suddenly grabbed the guitar and held it out. "You want to know something funny?" Elvis stared. "Your father once told me you would never become anything." The warehouse went silent. From the darkness, his father shouted, "I never said that." Elvis froze. Briggs smiled. "You see, people remember things differently." Elvis slowly looked at the guitar. Then back at Briggs. "You're lying." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Prove it." Elvis stepped forward. Raymond grabbed his arm. "Elvis." But Elvis held out his hand. Briggs handed him the guitar. The men laughed. Briggs shook his head. "Go on." Elvis held the instrument. "You came here with all these men." Briggs smiled. "So, and you're still afraid of one song." The smile disappeared. Elvis sat down. Raymond stared. "What are you doing?" Elvis looked at him. "Listening." Then Elvis began to play. One soft chord. Another. The warehouse changed. The men surrounding him looked confused. Briggs shouted, "Stop." Elvis continued. The melody was simple. The rhythm was familiar. His father had played it years ago. And somewhere behind the crates, his father began humming. Briggs turned. "Be quiet." But Elvis played louder. Not wildly. Not to impress. The melody traveled through the warehouse. Then Raymond recognized it. The rhythm Elvis had shown him. Raymond began tapping his hand against his leg. Daniel looked at him. "What are you doing?" Raymond smiled. "Listening." Briggs stepped toward Elvis. "Stop." But one of his own men suddenly moved aside. Then another. The music was doing something Briggs had never expected. It was reminding everyone that they were not machines, not shadows, not men who had to obey forever. Elvis stood with the guitar. The final chord echoed. Silence. Then, from behind the crates, a voice spoke. "That's enough, Walter." Briggs froze. A man stepped from the darkness. Elvis's father. Alive. Free. Two police officers appeared behind him. Briggs turned in shock. "What is this?" Elvis's father held up the missing document. "You should have checked your men." Sirens suddenly filled the street outside. Briggs ran toward the door, but Daniel stepped into his path. For 1 second, they stared at each other. Daniel whispered, "You were right about one thing." Briggs frowned. "What?" Daniel stepped aside. "The past doesn't disappear." The officers rushed inside. Briggs was surrounded. There was nowhere left to run. Minutes later, he was taken away. The warehouse slowly became quiet. Elvis stood beside his father. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then his father smiled. "You still play." Elvis laughed softly. "I learned from you." His father looked at the guitar. "You got better." Raymond suddenly laughed. Elvis turned. "What?" Raymond shook his head. "Nothing." He looked at Elvis, just thinking about how this night started. Daniel smiled for the first time. "With me insulting him." Raymond pointed at himself. "No, that was me." Everyone laughed, even Elvis. They walked outside. The rain had stopped. Early morning light was beginning to touch the streets of Memphis. Raymond looked toward Elvis. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you never tell us how much you knew about the guitar?" Elvis looked down at his hands, then smiled. "Because you never asked." Raymond nodded. That answer stayed with him. And somewhere between the ruined rehearsal studio and the silent warehouse, he understood the lesson Elvis had tried to teach him from the beginning. You cannot know a person's full story by looking at one chapter. You cannot measure their ability by what others say. And you should never decide what someone cannot do, simply because you have never seen them do it. A few hours earlier, they had laughed at Elvis Presley. They had challenged him. They had expected him to fail. Then he picked up a guitar, and everything changed. But in the end, the most powerful thing Elvis proved was not how well he could play. It was what he did after everyone realized they were wrong. He didn't humiliate them. He didn't celebrate. He taught them. And as the first light of morning filled the Memphis street, Elvis handed Raymond the guitar. "Take it." Raymond looked surprised. "Me?" Elvis smiled. "You wanted to learn." Raymond held the guitar. "What do we start with?" Elvis began walking toward the car with his father. Then he looked back and smiled. The first chord. And Raymond never forgot it. Because sometimes the world laughs at what it doesn't understand. Sometimes people decide your limits before you discover them yourself. But one day, the right moment comes. The laughter stops. The room becomes silent. And you don't need to argue. You don't need revenge. You don't need to explain who you are. Sometimes, you simply let your hands speak.